welcome to North American Ag Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. My guest today, who I'm very excited to talk to, is a natural resource policy expert with over 30 years' experience. Her education began on Pine Creek Ranch in central Nevada, where her family became one of the first Western landowners targeted by the radical environmental agenda, resulting in a 27-year legal battle. Now she serves as the executive director of American Stewards for Liberty. Today, we're going to discuss how American Stewards of Liberty are impacting the issues and about their convention that's going to be held later this month. From Georgetown, Texas, I would like to welcome Executive Director of American Stewards of Liberty, Margaret Byfield. Welcome, Margaret, and thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Chrissy. I really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you and get to know you.
Yeah, me too. So I've been following the 30 by 30 issue for many years. Now using my platform, I try to shed light on what it is, what the consequences of it being implemented are. But for people who are new to the issue, can you break it down for us so it's easy to understand?
Sure. It's really pretty simple. The 30 by 30 agenda is an international agenda to permanently protect 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. This means lands protected in their natural state. So these are not lands that we use. So if you think about 30% of America really being off limits to human use, that is their first goal. That's like the first step in a larger agenda, which is getting to the half Earth philosophy, which is protecting 50% of the land in its permanent natural state, permanently protected. So it's an international agenda that's actually been pushed for 30 years. But in America, it really didn't have its chance to be implemented until Biden was elected president. And 6 days into his office, he implemented 30 by 30 by executive order. He signed a big climate crisis executive order that was about 57 pages. And 2 paragraphs were in there relating to 30 by 30 that most people missed. And so that's one of the reasons it was able to kind of get some early traction. But fortunately, we were prepared for it. We knew it was coming. And so the day it came out, we started launching our grassroots campaign against it, started getting counties across the nation passing resolutions opposing it. The first one was passed 3 weeks after it was initiated. And then it created a really good firestorm across the West in particular. The West is the group that really got involved, and Nebraska was the other state. Nebraska has the most counties opposed to this officially. So, and then of course, the governor at the time is Governor Ricketts, and he immediately came out and opposed 30 by 30 and then led 15 other governors to sign a letter with him opposing 30 by 30, which was fantastic because it educated a lot of people on the national level what we were facing. So, I think there's a couple key things to understand about 30 by 30. One is when they initiated it, they said in America, only 12% of the lands are permanently protected in the state that they want to seek protection for the remaining 18%. So they didn't say this is the level that we are going to try to get to. What they say is this is all about conserving land and helping the working landowner do more with their land. That's how they sell the agenda. But we know what makes up that 12% because that comes from a USGS figure, and that is our national parks, very restricted. The only way you get into the national parks is if you've paid the fee and have a pass. And they're not used for extractive uses. The wilderness areas, which are also very restricted, and those are the areas that if you look at the West and you see all these fires, they usually start in the wilderness areas where they're not managed because they're kept in their natural state. And so the fires start easily there because there's so much fuel, and then they spread out of control, and then they start burning up the private lands. And so national wildlife refuges, another place that you have to have permission to go into. State parks and conservation easements on private lands in perpetuity. Those are the 5 major devices, levels of protection of land that they are seeking for 30% of our nation. It's huge. Governor Ricketts said early on, he said, this is the equivalent of protecting one state of Nebraska every year for the next 9 years, or 2 states of Texas. It's a lot of land, but that's their agenda. That's what they are seeking in America. So I think what's important for people to understand is they're selling it as a conservation program. But like everything, they have a great PR campaign, but you have to look behind that to see what are they really doing. And that's the agenda. That's what they're seeking.
And then since that was signed, has the Biden administration made progress? How much progress toward that goal?
Yeah, I actually think they have made an incredible amount of progress, but it's more on the front of getting everything in place. So we may not have seen a tick up in actual protected acres. I think the current figure is around 14% from the 12 to the 14%. They're making progress. But I think what's more important to understand is that they have used every tool they have administratively and through the executive branch to put the pieces in place to force landowners into that position where they have to encumber their lands with a federal nexus on the private lands in particular, either through the conservation easement or through the conservation programs. Those are key to them controlling the private lands. So they have been in the private lands, they did 2 things which farmers will be very familiar with. They increased the dollars they're paying per acre under programs like the Conservation Reserve Program. And they increase the type of lands that can be included in that. Well, when you have the Conservation Reserve Program on your land or like programs, it creates a federal nexus to that land, meaning there are other laws on the books that can now come, federal laws that can now come into play to use to restrict how that land is used because of that federal funding tied to the private land. A good example of that is the Endangered Species Act. So when a species is listed, a critical habitat, and critical habitat is designated, that does not apply to private lands. It only applies to federal lands unless there's any federal funding attached to that private land. Then critical habitat now applies to the private land. So, or the consultation process. It's kind of nuanced, and we can get into the weeds, which I don't really think that is really what the audience needs to hear, but that's the general concept. So that's what they have been doing, really pushing in the private lands. They've upped the amount of acres that they will accept. They've thrown a ton of money at landowners to sign up for all kinds of conservation programs. And then they have really pushed the conservation easements in perpetuity, and they've sent a ton of money to the land trusts to go out and push those on landowners. So those are 2 key devices on the private lands. On the federal lands, in simplistic terms, they have just increased restrictions on lands that they already own at every turn in every way they can. So what we're seeing kind of them, I think the first couple of years, they really laid the groundwork, get everything into place. Now this year, we're starting to see them kind of the birth pangs, if you want to think about it in those terms. We're starting to see more aggressive actions happening, such as several national monuments that have now been declared in recent time. They released the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management Conservation Planning Rule, which will prioritize conservation over the multiple uses that are statutorily authorized on the federal lands. So they are elevating conservation through rulemaking, not through the statute, but through rulemaking. And we're seeing the same thing happen on the Forest Service side too. We'll have new planning rules coming out there as well that I think are going to do the same thing. So, and there's a bunch of other things happening, but those are kind of the 2 big picture, I think, things to think about that's happening on the private lands and on the federal lands.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. Now, tell me about your background and what has been the outcome for your legal battle, the Heggie versus the United States.
Yeah, so I was raised on Pine Creek Ranch, which you said, and that was a ranch that we bought in 1978. central Nevada. So very, very remote area of Nevada. If you were to put a pin in the middle of Nevada, that's about where a ranch house sat. So we were 60 miles from Tonopah, Nevada, which is anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 population, and 60 miles from Austin, Nevada, which is maybe 500 population. Those were our two big towns.
Wow.
And so very remote. You know, to get into our place, it was all dirt road. We didn't have poled electricity. We had hydro plants and, you know, generators. That was our electricity. Didn't have phone, didn't have satellite. So you would think that remote, we wouldn't be harming anybody, right? Well, the problem is the environmentalists and the government really wanted the land. So, or more importantly, I think it really was about the water. So the moment that we bought that ranch, in our first grazing season with the Forest Service, it was a 105-day grazing season. And they issued 40 certified letters and made 70 visits to our house complaining, noticing us of violations that we were making to our grazing permits. So you have to understand, in the West, it's much different than the East. So in the West, 50% of the West is federalized. The federal government owns 50% of the land in the West, 87% of the land in Nevada. So our ranch, we ran on 1,100 square miles. Only 7,000 acres of that was private. But we had the grazing rights, owned the grazing rights to all of that land. And importantly, we owned the water. And in the West, water is the gold. So it really was about our water. What the Forest Service did was they filed a claim over every one of our water rights on the forest lands. And then they started ramping up the regulatory pressures, such as all of these notices that we were violating our grazing permits. And I'll give you one example, and I think it's worth telling your audience this if they're not familiar with what our world is going to look like if the government owns all of our land. This is what it's going to look like. So one of the violations to our grazing permit was that we were not maintaining our drift fences on Table Mountain. So those are our fences between our allotment and our neighbor's allotment. And Table Mountain is 12,000 foot elevation. It's 25 miles across the top. It's wilderness. So you can't have anything mechanical up there. There's only 3 trails up and 3 trails down. So to check the fence, Dad sent up a rider with a pack horse loaded down with everything you might need to repair a fence. It takes a day to get up. He rides across the top. So that's another day and another day to get down. And he comes into the house and he hands Dad this blue flag. And Dad said, okay, so that's where the Forest Service marked where the problem was. And Dad said, okay, so what was the problem? And they said, well, in 25 miles of fence, there was 1 staple missing.
No way.
That was our violation to our grazing permit. So, you know, you have to understand. And so we went through 13 years of this. We filed 3 administrative appeals against them. We won every one, but they would just come back the next year and do the same thing to us, maybe a little differently.
Funding, right?
Exactly. And that was all expenses that we had to pay ourselves. So after the third one, Mom and Dad finally decided we're done with this. We want to know, what do we own or what don't we own in the West? And so they filed the first federal lands grazing takings case in the United States, the Hage versus United States, my family's case. And so we went through 13 years of that level of harassment, 3 administrative appeals court cases, and then 27 years in the claims court. And the claims court sided with us. And the DC circuit in DC, they actually overturned the decision. And on 2 technicalities, not on the question of what did we own or what didn't we own, but they said we didn't have standing or ripeness, which was basically they just punted. You know, they didn't want to see this case get across the finish line because it would have absolutely changed the West. So there were a lot of reasons and a lot of people that wanted to stop this case. You know, interesting in all of that. And I tell you this just because I think it's important for people to understand what our world is going to look like if they accomplish 30 by 30 or 50 by 50.
Yeah.
But after we filed that takings case 5 months later, the Forest Service filed 2 criminal charges against my dad for removing valuable timber off the federal lands. And all that was about was he removed trees out of the middle of our ditch right away, which we were completely authorized to do. So, and at the same time, because they had filed a claim over all of our water, we were also in a state water adjudication proceeding with the state of Nevada to prove up all of our water rights. So essentially, we were involved in 3 lawsuits at once: the water appropriations case, the criminal charges against my dad. And he was actually convicted by a jury in Las Vegas and was under house arrest for 6 months. Ninth Circuit overturned it, thankfully. I mean, the very liberal Ninth Circuit saw that it was such an egregious attack, and they knew it was an attempt to try to get him to drop the takings case that we had. And then, of course, the takings case. So, that is our story. I kind of hate telling it because it's really a difficult one to swallow, that in America, this can happen to a landowner. And Ronald Reagan is probably he is one of my very favorite presidents. But most of what happened to us happened during his administration.
Really? Wow.
Those 13 years were under the Bush and Reagan years. They started in Carter, but then went through Reagan and then the first Bush. So even though philosophically, I think we agreed with Reagan and his agenda and what he wanted to accomplish, the reality is the president, even the Secretary of the Interior, and nor Congress, do they really have any operational control over the administrative agencies. They haven't had it for a long time. Mm-hmm. And that's what our case bears out, that even when we have really good people at the top, our administrative agencies, they are a fourth branch. They are absolutely in control. And I'll tell you, a good book to read if you really want to understand this is former Secretary of Interior David Bernhardt's book, You Report to Me. And that's a really good expose on the administrative agencies and how, as secretary, how little functional control he had over many elements and the personnel, the green personnel that's entrenched inside these agencies. So, I think we need to understand that if we don't take now as our moment to reclaim our property rights and to stop this green agenda, that is what the entire country is going to look like. And I have said from the very beginning, if agriculture will step up and just simply say, absolutely not, we completely disagree with 30 by 30, instead of trying to nuance it, which unfortunately a lot of the big ag groups are doing. They want to play both sides. They want to have a seat at the table. So instead of taking a strong stand against this agenda, they're in on the caper, frankly, from my perspective. And I respect a lot of them, but I've been there. I know what this world's going to look like, and I don't want to see it happen to the rest of the nation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so obvious that this impacts producers, but it also obviously affects consumers. But I tend to think that they remain oblivious because they don't see the impact. They're like, oh, that's the Wild West. But they eat. Everybody eats. So what can you say to a consumer to get their attention then?
Well, I think one thing that's really good is if you follow Epic TV or Epic Times, they have a fantastic publication, and they are very, I would say, brave. They're not afraid to take on the difficult topics. So Roman Bolmakoff came and interviewed us last November for a documentary that he was putting together, which they're getting ready to release, No Farmers, No Food. So he went to the Netherlands, he went to Sri Lanka, he interviewed landowners in America. It's a fantastic documentary. And actually, we're very pleased. They are doing their red carpet premiere of this film. So the first viewing of this film is going to be at our summit in September in Irving. So Roman will be in, and then a lot of the Epic TV, but they'll have a red carpet so that they can interview people coming through. And they really do want to get the farmers, the ranchers, on TV, on their cameras to really talk to them about what's going on. So I think part of getting to the urban public, that audience that that we really need to reach and communicate this message to, I think that's one vehicle. They're doing a phenomenal job. But I think the other thing that is important is it's bigger than just our food. So when we talk about the property rights issue, we talk about it in terms of its land and liberty. The two are connected. You cannot have individual liberty without ownership of the land.
Yeah.
And that's just a basic American right. We are so unusual. We were the first nation, literally, built on the concept that the people would own the land. Right. So it wasn't just that the people were going to govern and that our Constitution was going to enumerate the rights, the things that the government can't do to us and the rights they can't take away from us. That's a piece of paper. How do we enforce that? And our founders understood the only way the people could enforce that was to make sure that the people owned the land. That meant every individual had the ability to grow its own food if it had to, build its own shelter, have the ability to protect that shelter against any other entity that might want to take it. And then also have an economic, the ability to create wealth and not only the things you needed for your own survival, but also to contribute to the local economy and then to the state economy and then the national economy. So they understood that it was the individual's ability to own the land that was going to be 100% the reason for the success of this nation. They knew how that was tied. And if we own the land, we the people, we can protect our liberties. We can protect our food security. We can protect our gun rights. We can protect our freedom of speech if we have the control over our government and have the ability to limit it. So that's really what this is all about. And we have to understand that the opposition understands this. They are on a track of communism, socialism. They want to get America under that control. So Karl Marx defined socialism as the abolishment of private property. He was exactly right. John Adams said, property must be secured or liberty cannot exist. He was exactly right. You know, from my perspective, that is the message. That's what Americans have forgot. Because first off, it's not taught in our schools anymore. We don't teach American history anymore in our public schools. So we have a whole generation that doesn't even understand what is probably the most important thing to them having their individual liberty. They don't even understand that concept, which is extremely sad.
It is.
But, and we're seeing the impact in our politics. But that, I think, to people who are starting to get aware that we have a problem in this country and trying to figure out what is the source of that problem, we can point to a lot of things, but ultimately it boils down to, are the people going to own the land to be able to control their government or not? It's land and liberty. Yeah. So right now, the government owns 40% of the land, all the governments, local, state, and federal. We only own 60% of that. And a lot of that is encumbered with things like the conservation programs and the conservation easements in perpetuity. So functionally, Americans control even less of that land. So that's why I say we are at a tipping point. This is a moment we've got to decide, are we going to stand up and defend property rights or not?
Yeah, that's it. And even just recently, I believe this week in the Washington Times, or maybe it was last week, there was an article about even just home ownership now and the evils of home ownership. So it is rolling downhill. It's right now, the pressure is on producers, but it is going to come right down to the home that you live in and how unfair home ownership is. So you can just see it slowly creep, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. They definitely want, I think mainly the people living in the cities who don't have that direct connection to the land, they really want to get them to buy into this agenda that we shouldn't own anything because that allows them to have control over us. I'll tell you one thing that my dad said years and years ago, which has always stuck with me. I think is on point. And he said, either you have the right to own property or you are property. Now, if you think about that, that is correct.
Yeah.
And these people who are imposing this climate crisis agenda and this idea that we shouldn't own anything, they understand that too.
Yeah.
They understand it very well. But, we need to understand that. The masses in America need to understand that so that we can appropriately fight back.
Yeah, that's it. And the EPA came out very recently with a revision to the WOTUS ruling wording in response to the Supreme Court ruling on Sackett versus EPA. So is this going far enough? Are we still pressing forward? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that what's really interesting, first off, their new rule, of course, they're not accepting a Sackett decision. I read a Washington Post article which talked about how the EPA was complaining that because of the Sackett decision, they can no longer regulate 63% of the waters they currently are. And of course, our side is cheering because that's exactly right. They shouldn't be allowed to do that because the law does not allow it. But again, which is very typical, and it gets back to our original, discussion about the administrative agencies. They are their own entity. They live by their own interpretation of the laws, not what the law actually says. So this new rule is basically a workaround, their next attempt to figure out how we say we're going to comply with the Sackett court decision, but in essence, really not. So, I think that we have to get control of the administrative agencies before we can really change a lot of these things. But what I love right now is that Sackett ruling was probably the property rights ruling of the century. Absolutely. That was a huge kick in the teeth to the environmental side. They know that they lost a huge, huge tool. So it's going to take some time. It's going to be a lot of lawsuits that are going to have to go back in and challenge this new rule that EPA is doing. But the legal precedence is being set now. That's turning, and it's turning in our favor in a big way. So, I really think that it's been over the last 2 years, it's been the states who have been standing up against this, those that will, and the Supreme Court that have been saving us, really. So on one hand, when you're in these kind of battles, you have to recognize that there's always this movement, and when there's kind of a change of movement and change of direction. And I really see that happening on our issues now, which is all the more reason why now's the time to really stand up and put up a fight for our property rights.
Absolutely. And on August 8th in Arizona, President Biden, you kind of touched on this before, he announced the designation of over 917,000 acres of land, and that land contains uranium underneath, which could be used for clean energy here in the U.S. So I'll add that this is his 5th monument designation since becoming president. So it doesn't make sense. What's happening?
Well, you can trace a lot of these monument designations back to exactly what you pointed out, a mineral deposit.
Right.
This really isn't about protecting the land. This is about withdrawing those minerals from Americans being able to utilize them. If you'll remember back in the in the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, gave away a lot of our mineral deposits to, I believe it was Chinese investors. By the president withdrawing these from development by Americans, that really gives them the ability to decide who is going to utilize those resources. So here's another thing that I think is really interesting, because you can trace all of these real land grabs back to a key component, either a key industry or resource that they want to control, or a mineral deposit. So things like the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, 1.8 million acres that Clinton designated. That he did that days before the cleanest coal burning mine, I think second in the world, largest in the United States, was ready to go online. They had environmental clearance. He did that just days after that. That monument designation was not about saving the beautiful area of the Escalante area. It was about withdrawing that coal from being developed by Americans. So you can trace all of these back to all of these land withdrawals. You have boundary waters. That's another mineral-rich area that that they did a 20-year moratorium on. You have Chaco Canyon, another that's right by this monument designation. That's another area where they did a 20-year moratorium on mineral, oil, and gas development. It also is rich with our rare earth minerals, which we really need to develop ourselves. So you can trace all these things back to this. You can actually go back to when the West was federalized, back when the decision was made that federal government would no longer dispose of the land to the people, but it would retain those. And that had a lot to do with the Comstock Lode and the big mineral developments that have been discovered and the big forest reserves. And basically the robber barons of that day who said, boy, if we can't control it, then nobody's going to until we can. And so that's why the West was locked up. And when they did that, they federalized lands that were very rich in mineral development. So my dad had he wrote an article years and years ago called The Collateralization of America's Debt. And he had done kind of a history of when we started accumulating debt as a nation, and then how all of these land withdrawals aligned with the increase of the debt. So even, Yellowstone National Park, Yosemite National Park, those all started about that time when we really started accumulating national debt. And so he kind of traced it up to, his day. And he was convinced that this was all about, not about conservation. It's all about having to be able to collateralize our national debt. So I think, if you follow that through, we're seeing America, increase an incredible amount of debt right now. What's going to back that up? And so at the same time, we see Biden making all of these land withdrawals. So I think that's pretty insightful and probably on point.
Yeah, I never thought of that before. That's really interesting. Wow. So with all of this going on, I hear, and I know I'm in this every day. I'm listening to it every day. I'm hearing, so I'm a little bit closer than most, the average person, to these issues. And especially considering I came from Canada and what's happened, in my own country. But I hear all the time from people that they just don't get into politics, that, they don't want to be part of the divide. They can't change anything anyway. What do you say to those people right now in this moment?
Well, I think because of how everything is being ramped up, we no longer have that luxury. So if you're not in the fight, you're on the other side, literally, because they are utilizing the people, the acquiescence of the people, the non-involvement of the people is working all to their favor. So we're at a moment where it's becoming crystal clear what's happening. You don't have to be daily tuned into politics. You can just check in every now and then and realize something big is happening in this country. And there is a huge political shift. And the Biden administration has gone to such extreme to implement things that it's very hard to ignore. So, we're just at that point where we no longer have the luxury to sit on the sidelines nor sit on the fence. It is coming down to which side of this are you on? Are you on the side of America's founding principles and individual liberty and prosperity, or are you on the side of control of the people? Because that's what it's coming down to. And it's very hard to ignore. So I think that those people who still are kind of living in a closet and just don't want to participate in it, I actually feel very sorry for them, because they're the ones that are probably going to be hurt the most because they haven't prepared. When they finally, there will come a day where they realize, oh my goodness, I have been supporting this and I didn't realize I was. And it'll be a moment of reckoning, and probably a moment of personal, a lot of personal troubles, because they haven't been tuned into this to be discerning about what's coming ahead and prepare appropriately for it. So there's no fence to sit on anymore. You have to take a stand. And I think we're at that moment.
Right. Yeah. And I totally agree with you there. I think one of the first steps, it's like you don't see it, and then you can't stop seeing it. Right. So I think that first step is just research. So people need to take those first steps in research. But how, in a time where we don't have a lot of time, everybody's busy, where do they start with that research? And how do they stay cautious to not just rely on hearsay? Like, you can have a lot of talking heads saying a lot of things, but it's important to look behind those words, right?
Yeah, it really is. I think on 30 by 30, a good place to start is we have a website that we put up called stop30by30.americanstewards.us. And that just has 30 by 30 information on it. Some of it is ours, but most of it is the governments and the environmentalists. So we have a lot of the primary documents there. And that's a really good question. And people don't have the time to dive into these subjects like we do. This is what we do. But you're out, you're ranching, you're farming, you're in your fields, and you get in, have dinner, and then you may have a couple hours to read and try to catch up, not only on your business, but on what's going on in the world, which you have to be in tune to because it affects your business. So one of the things that we do is we try to really drill down into these issues, digest them, and then produce them in a form that our audience, which is the farmers and ranchers, the landowners, can digest those quickly and understand the concepts, and then have the ability to dig into the documents they want to see more of. So like on 30 by 30, 3 weeks after it was launched, we produced this 12-page, basically Q&A on 30 by 30, which we are still publishing and updating as the issues evolve. And it was just Q&A. What is 30 by 30? How is it being implemented? And all of these things, so that you can really scan, digest it quickly. And then if you wanted to go read, the executive order, you could read it. If you wanted to go read the fact sheet that Department of Interior put out the day that it was implemented, and see what they said about 30 by 30, you could go there, because we had all those linked. So, I do a 30 by 30 presentation. And one of the things that I do in this is I use a lot of slides. And the reason for that, and they're all the environmental or the government slides, the reason for that is to make sure that as I'm talking about this, people don't think that I'm some crazy lady talking about this. They actually say this. They are actually pushing this. The evidence is there. And I know how many hours I had to put into before the president was elected to understand what 30 by 30 was. I understand not everybody can do that. But I think just finding good, trustworthy sources. And that's one of the things we really try to do in our organization, is kind of fill that need. We digest it, and then we try to get it out to our people in a form that's easy to understand, can be quickly read as quickly as can, and then have all of the backup documents for anybody who wants to drill deeper into it. And so, we produce a Liberty Matters online publication every 2 weeks, and that's where we hit a lot of these stories. And so it's where you can kind of keep up with what's going on on this issue, all property rights related issues and all the connected issues. I think it's a good digest for people to learn. And then, finding the good organizations doing this work, whether it's our organization or other organizations that support them, make sure you're getting their material, because that's really the function that they are providing you to help educate.
Right. That's great advice. And I like what you said about really, getting it from the horse's mouth. Whether you read the bills, they're not that long.
Yeah.
Reading the executive orders, read that yourself. When this first started kind of raising some hackles around the agriculture community, I went and read all of Klaus Schwab's books, right? You have to go right back, and the biggest evidence is what they're telling us, right? So you don't have to listen to Glenn Beck. You don't have to listen to, the people talking about it. You don't have to listen to me or you. Just go and see what they're saying themselves. So I like that. That's, get right back to, follow it back to the bill and to the executive order.
That is such good advice. And I'm really kind of admire that you did that. I mean, that's amazing. I really appreciate that. How we are always fighting NEPA issues, the National Environmental Policy issue comes into play in so many parts of agriculture for us to be able to do anything in agriculture. One thing I like to tell people is read the statute, because the statute is only 4 pages. And, you think about these big issues, and this is another thing that we do strategically. We actually help a lot of entities on the ground. So we go in, we work with a lot of local governments, and we will go in and help them bring the federal agencies to the table with them, because the federal agencies don't like to do that, because that creates too much accountability. But we do coordination meetings and open coordination meetings with the federal agencies. It's a government to government meeting, and we help facilitate those in several places across the West. And and then we will go in, and I'll sit at the table with them and help advocate the local government's position. So I'll sit there with commissioners. And the primary thing that I do in those meetings is, when the federal agents sitting at the table start trying to explain the law to the county commissioners, thinking, oh, they don't have time to understand this. And most county commissioners don't. They have so many issues they have to handle. And the federal agencies can get away with that with them. But, I have read those laws. And I'm not an attorney, but laws are meant not just for attorneys, they're meant for the people. So I've read them, and as we have written a lot of policy. And so I figure if I'm writing policy, I better have an accurate understanding of the law. So I've done a lot of study on that side. But the primary thing I do in those meetings is start questioning them when they start trying to explain the law. And most of the people, and I don't mean this as a criticism personally to them, they're not trained on what the law says. They are trained on what the handbook says, which is like 2 generations removed from what the actual statute says. And so just in those meetings, being able to kind of explain to them, no, that's really not what the statute says, and have that conversation with them. A lot of them will kind of back up and say, wow, okay, somebody here sitting at the table that knows this law. And that in and of itself has been very effective at getting the agencies to actually follow the law instead of their handbooks where they should. But that's another thing we do, is, which I think is really important that you pointed out, is going back to that original document is important. And I've told many of the commissioners we worked with, go read NEPA, the law, and you will see that it's really interesting. That law talks a lot about the productive use of the land, and creating an environment for man's enjoyment. And so when you first read through NEPA, you're thinking, wait a minute, this law is written completely different with in the way that it's been implemented. So it's really interesting. But that's fantastic advice. Don't be intimidated by these documents. Here's another thing that I think with agriculture in particular is very well suited to read these things. I think the people in agriculture are some of the smartest people I work with. I don't care how many degrees they have. I know just the on-the-job training that they have in life to do their business, how bright they have to be to succeed on a number of issues, not just 1 or 2, but on a whole scale of issues. And so, I have a lot of faith in our agriculture community. I think they're our best and brightest in many ways. So I don't think any of them should be intimidated by this material. They are very sharp, very capable of understanding these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And changing gears a little bit, I know you have deep respect for our Creator. What role does faith play in your life?
It's the primary role. Absolutely. I think when you're in the middle of these battles, sometimes they can get you down, but I just see it. I just see it differently. This isn't our fight. This is his fight. We're his warriors. And I've thought many times at what an unusual situation for me to have been placed in. I was placed in the family that was targeted by the environmentalists and the government and raised in that environment. Why? And we ended up spending so much time fighting that battle, and there's so much personal, emotional, physical energy that goes into that, and then to lose it after all of those years. What was the reason for all of that? But what I think when you go through a situation like that, you can either be bitter about it, or you use it as fuel and purpose and lessons. And, going through all of that, I think I have a body of personal experiences that a lot of people don't. And that's the reason why I think I was put in that situation, was that there were bigger fights ahead. And I needed to figure out how to utilize that experience in a way that can benefit others and to help keep us from getting in that situation at a bigger scale. So all of that is faith-based. You have to understand that we are very small on our own, but we are very powerful when we are following his word and doing his work and doing it his way. And I think everything that we do at American Stewards, both my husband and I we have very deep faith. And we do not see this battle as a problem. We see it as an incredible opportunity. A lot of great things come out of difficult situations. And if we can utilize this situation to turn the course of America back towards one that is built on the principles our founders had in establishing this country, and along with it, of course, bringing more people to understand that we are not in control, God is in control. And we need to get on board with that. And it gets back to the other question you asked: which side are you on?
Yeah.
This is a spiritual battle. And I don't know, I think that we have been placed in a moment of time that is so absolutely exciting. I mean, yes, there's a lot of things that we can frown on and that can be a little scary about what's coming ahead. But he picked us to be in this world at this time, in this place. He does things for a purpose. He doesn't do things by mistake. So he has a role for all of us in this. And I would say that applies to you and I, and it applies to everyone listening to this podcast. He has given us a role and an opportunity to choose a side and to get in the fight. One of the proverbs that I use when I speak is the horse is prepared for battle, but the Lord will deliver the victory, which means we are to prepare for battle. We are to get into the fight. We don't have to worry so much about how are we going to win this fight, because I feel like I'm a pretty good expert on 30 by 30 and the property rights issues. I couldn't tell you how we're going to win this fight. I know a few things now we can do that are certainly going to move us in that position, but that's not our job. Our job is to prepare for battle, fight the battle, because the Lord is going to deliver that victory. That's his job. He needs us to do ours, and he absolutely will do his. So I don't know if that it certainly wasn't a short answer, but that's faith is everything for us.
Yeah, that's so well said. And one thing that I'll point out that you said was, we have our choice whether to do it or not, right? And that's, I guess, probably the freedom we all want, that a lot of us desire. And we cherish that freedom that we can choose whether to fight or not. I thought that was interesting the way you said it.
Yeah.
Very good. So how can people learn more about the Stop 30 by 30 Summit? It's taking place September 21st to 23rd in Irving, Texas. And it's your second annual event, right?
Yes, on this issue, it's the second annual Stop 30 by 30 Summit that we've done. We do have a website. It's the stop30by30summit.com website. And you can go there and you can take a look at all the speakers we have coming in. That's a really good place to start. There's a couple cool things happening. Well, first off, let me tell you that who's on the agenda. Nobody goes on our agenda unless they're in the fight. So you will see county commissioners on the agenda because they're on the front lines of this, fighting this for their community. And you will see heads of national organizations that are on it. We don't necessarily try to bring in people with big names that give a good speech. Right. We bring in people who can teach you how to stop this in your community because they are doing it. That's the goal of our agenda. So it's a very meaty agenda. What's really cool is the way that the conference is set up is all the attendees really get to mix with these people and learn from them, talk to them one-on-one, and connect and get those contacts so they can reach out to them down the road too as they get into issues. So that's one of the really important parts of the summit. But the other cool thing that is happening is Epic TV is holding the red carpet premiere at the summit for the new documentary coming out called No Farmers, No Food. This is a fantastic film. We've seen the rough cut. It's remarkable. Roman went to the Netherlands, to Sri Lanka, he interviewed several landowners in America, and really the question he was answering is there a global push to create a food security crisis, and why? What's the purpose of that? And really, he concludes that globally, there's a huge push to move the small landowner off the land and to put everything into the big corporate, wealthy elites' control through our food system policies. So he does a fantastic job. But the other part of it, the subtitle is, "Will you eat the bugs?" Because he also visited some of the bug farms. So how they're pushing that you shouldn't eat meat, but you should eat bugs. So he dove into that too. It's extremely interesting what he did. Wow. But that's a phenomenal film. And I'm really, really honored that they decided to do the premiere at the summit. It's going to be a fantastic, fantastic event. So the summit's 2 days. It's just a great time. I know we're talking about a difficult topic, but I promise you will walk out inspired and equipped. This is where we really get, we not only inform, but we get strategic too. This is what we plan to do. We're doing a lot of things behind the scenes that we'll be there to share with people, things that they can implement locally and at the state and at the national level. So we're going to talk about a tough topic, but it's all about how we fight it and how we stop it. So it's actually a pretty inspiring conference.
Oh, awesome. I really wish that I could be there this year, but I will be there next year for sure. It just sounds so awesome. And thank you so much, Margaret, for joining me today. Excellent information. And you've given us hope for what we can all do to do our part.
Thank you. I really appreciate you giving me this time and us to get to know each other.
Awesome. And thanks to everyone who's watching or listening. If you want to learn more, the links are provided in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe to North American Ag Spotlight on YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram channels. And the podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Listen Notes, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also obviously find us on NorthAmericanAg.com. And if you liked the episode, I would love it if you shared it. Have a great day.